The mockery and the challenge. The vast chamber of the alien court shimmered with pale silver light that came from crystals set into the tall walls. The air was heavy with the scent of burning oils, sharp and foreign, and the sound of voices echoed like the roar of an ocean storm. Warriors in bright armor stood in neat rows, their long blades strapped to their sides, while nobles in robes of deep colors sat on high stone benches, watching the center of the hall with expectant eyes. They were not gathered for war or peace talks, but for sport. They had come to see a human dot in the middle of the chamber. Chained to a steel post stood Daniel. His body carried bruises from capture, and his uniform, once the plain gray of an Earth officer, was torn. He looked small among them, not only in height but in presence. The alien race towering around him had broad shoulders, bright skin patterns across their faces, and the proud bearing of conquerors. To them he was nothing more than an insect caught in a net, a curiosity that had survived a little too long on the battlefield before being taken alive. Murmurs rolled through the court. Some laughed at his thin arms. Others whispered that this fragile being was proof that Earth was weak, a planet of soft creatures unfit for war. Daniel heard it all, but he did not lower his gaze. His brown eyes stayed firm, scanning the hall, searching not for escape, but for meaning. He knew he was alone, the only human in this chamber of thousands. They could end him in a breath if they wished. Yet still, he stood straight, shoulders back, breathing slowly as though daring them to try. The great doors at the far end opened, and silence fell like a heavy cloak. The princess entered. She walked with the grace of a blade-in water, her robes flowing with silver threads that caught the light of the crystals. Her crown was a circlet of glowing stones, and her eyes burned with the cold fire of someone born to command. Every warrior bent the knee as she passed, yet Daniel remained upright, not out of defiance but because no one had told him to kneel. And he would not kneel unless forced. Princess Lyra stepped into the center and studied him. For a long breath she said nothing, only circling him slowly like a predator sizing up prey. Daniel met her eyes. He was tired, his lips dry, but he did not flinch. A thin smile curved her lips as she finally spoke. "So this is the human soldier who would not die," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber. The nobles laughed softly, some covering their mouths, others showing their sharp teeth without shame. "You look weaker than a child of 5 seasons. Tell me, human, did you think you could fight against my people? Did you believe Earth could stand against the empire of Lyra's blood?" Daniel's voice was rough but steady. "I fought because it was right. I fought because I had no other choice. That is what humans do." The words brought louder laughter. The hall filled with the sound of amusement, 1,000 voices crashing over him like waves. Yet Lyra raised her hand in silence. Fell once more. Her eyes narrowed, but the smile on her lips remained. "Perhaps your kind fights," she said, "but fighting is not the same as winning, and here you have lost. Still, there is something curious in you, something that almost entertains me." She turned, letting her robe sweep across the polished floor. Then, with the air of one giving a joke to a crowd, she declared, "I will make a promise. Listen well, all of you, so none can say I lied. This human shall enter the death trials. If he survives them, if by some strange twist of fate he lives to the end, then I shall marry him. He will be bound by law as my chosen. But I have no fear of that day, for he will never make it alive." The court erupted. The nobles laughed so hard their jeweled cups shook. Warriors struck their spears against the stone in rhythm, jeering. Some cried out bets of how quickly the human would fall, whether in the first hour or the first beast's jaws. The death trials were not for mortals. They were a cruel gauntlet built to test the mightiest of champions from across the stars. None of Daniel's kind had ever seen such trials. let alone survive them. Daniel stood still, though his chains rattled faintly as he shifted his weight. His mind was racing, but his face betrayed nothing. He looked up at the princess, who now gazed at him like one might at a moth fluttering toward flame. His throat was dry, but he forced his voice to rise. "I accept," he said. The words cut through the laughter like a blade. For a heartbeat, silence returned. Then the chamber shook, with noise once more, louder than before. Some shouted that the human was mad, others that he had courage beyond his size, but all were certain that it would not matter. The outcome to them was already written. The princess tilted her head, her smile growing colder. "Very well. You accept, then so be it. Let it be recorded in the halls of our ancestors. This human dares the death trials." Guards stepped forward, their armor clattering as they unclasped his chains. They did not treat him gently. One shoved him forward while another pulled his arms behind his back. Daniel staggered but did not fall. The chamber blurred around him as he was dragged toward the gate that led out of the court and into the dark tunnels of the arena. The crowd still laughed, still shouted, still mocked, but beneath it all there was a faint edge of curiosity. How long would he last? As Daniel was pulled into the shadows, he let out a slow breath. His heart hammered in his chest, not from fear of death, though death was near, but from the fire of defiance burning inside him. They thought him weak. They thought humans were soft. But he knew something they did not. He knew that when pressed to the edge, when survival demanded more than strength, humans had a way of enduring. The princess turned back to her court, waving her hand as though dismissing the matter. "It will be entertaining," she said. "We shall see how quickly he is broken." But even as she spoke, a small thought stirred at the back of her mind. The way the human's eyes had met hers without flinching, the way he had accepted without hesitation, there was something strange about it. She shook it off, returning to her throne, convinced that by dawn the human would be nothing more than a broken body in the sand of the arena. Yet deep in the tunnels, as Daniel's chains were removed and a heavy door creaked open to the unknown beyond, he whispered only 4 words to himself: "I will not fall," and the trials began. The death trials begin. The great iron door groaned as it opened, and the sound rolled through the stone tunnels like thunder. Daniel stepped forward slowly, his bare feet meeting the rough ground, and he found himself staring into a place that seemed designed by cruelty itself. The arena stretched wide and endless, its floor covered in dust and broken stone, with jagged cliffs rising like teeth on either side. The sky above was strange, painted with swirling clouds that glowed faintly green, as though some alien sun burned just beyond the horizon. He could not tell if the sky was real or an illusion crafted to unsettle him, but either way, it carried a weight that pressed against his chest. The gate clanged shut behind him, and the sound echoed like the closing of a tomb. For a moment he was alone, with only the rush of wind and the sound of his own breath. Yet above, hidden within balconies carved into the rock, the alien court watched. Their whispers floated down faintly, mixed with laughter and shouts, a reminder that every step he took was under the gaze of those who expected his end. Daniel did not look up. He focused instead on the ground before him, forcing his thoughts into calm order. Fear wanted to climb into his throat, but he swallowed it. He told himself over and over, survival first, one step at a time. The floor of the arena trembled, and from a distant corner came a sound like grinding stone. Slowly a gate rose from the earth, and from within stalked the first of the beasts. It was larger than any predator Daniel had seen on earth, its body low and coiled with muscle, its skin shining with scales the color of rust. 6 eyes glowed faint yellow on its head, and its mouth split open to reveal layers of jagged teeth. The crowd above roared at its appearance. their voices merging into a single wave of hunger for blood. Daniel stood still, letting the creature study him. He had no weapon in his hands, nothing but his body, and he knew rushing blindly would mean death. Instead, he watched its steps, the way it shifted its weight, the slight hesitation before it lunged. When it sprang at him, he threw himself sideways, rolling across the dirt as its jaws snapped shut on empty air. Pain lanced through his shoulder where he hit the ground, but he ignored it and scrambled to his feet. The beast turned with shocking speed, charging again, but this time Daniel had already moved toward a cluster of jagged rocks that rose from the floor. The alien court jeered, calling him a coward for running, but Daniel knew better. He could not win with strength. He needed the land itself to be his weapon. He pressed his back to the rocks, and when the beast lunged again, he ducked low, letting its bulk crash into stone. Dust and shards flew as the creature roared, stunned for a moment by the impact. Daniel seized the chance, picking up a broken shard of rock sharp enough to cut skin. He held it tight, waiting as the beast shook itself and turned again with rage. It came for him once more, but this time Daniel met its charge with desperate timing. He slid under its body, feeling the heat of its scales above him, and with a shout he drove the stone upward into its soft underbelly. The shard tore deep, and the beast shrieked, thrashing wildly. Daniel rolled clear as it collapsed, its legs kicking weakly before it lay still. Silence filled the arena for a breath, broken only by the ragged sound of Daniel's breathing. Then the crowd erupted. Not in laughter but in surprise, Daniel leaned against the rocks, chest heaving. His hands were slick with blood, both the beast's and his own where the jagged stone had cut him. He forced himself to stay standing, to not let them see weakness. He looked up at the hidden balconies, and though he could not see faces clearly, he imagined their eyes on him, waiting for him to fall. He raised his chin, showing them he was still alive. From her high seat, Princess Lyra narrowed her gaze. She had expected the human to be torn apart in the first minutes. Instead she had watched him move with strange cunning, using the arena itself as though it were a tool in his hand. She told herself it was luck, nothing more, yet something in her chest stirred. A flicker of interest that she quickly smothered. The ground shifted again, and another gate opened. This time 3 smaller creatures emerged, lean and fast, with claws that scraped sparks from the stone. They circled Daniel in silence, their eyes glowing with hunger. The crowd cheered louder, certain that the human would not escape 3 attackers. Daniel tightened his grip on the bloodied shard of stone. His muscles screamed for rest, but his mind sharpened. He thought of Earth, of the nights spent training, with nothing but his wits and bare hands, of the words of his old commander who once told him that humans survived not by strength, but by refusal to yield. He let those memories fuel him. The first beast sprang and Daniel dodged, slashing with the stone across its face. The second came from the side and caught him with its claws, tearing a line of fire across his ribs. He staggered but did not fall. Pain blurred his sight, yet he turned it into fury. He seized the wounded beast by its snout and drove the stone deep into its eye. It shrieked and collapsed, thrashing until it grew still. The second and third closed in, their movements faster. More careful now. Daniel backed toward the rocks again, breathing hard, blood dripping down his side. They attacked together, and for a moment, it seemed he would be torn apart. But he dropped low, letting them crash against each other, and with a desperate surge, he struck at the nearest throat. Warm blood sprayed across his arms as the beast fell, and the last one, now alone, hesitated. Daniel rose slowly, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the creature. Though his body trembled, he took a step forward instead of back. The beast growled. But then, sensing something in the human's stance, something that whispered of relentless will, it turned and slunk away into the shadows where it had come. The arena fell silent once more. The crowd did not laugh this time. Some whispered in disbelief, others stared in stunned quiet. Daniel, bleeding and shaking, had done the impossible twice. High above, the princess sat with her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the figure below. She no longer smiled. For the first time she wondered if her words spoken in mockery might carry a weight she had never intended. Daniel lifted his face toward the unseen stars above the arena and whispered again to himself, "I will not fall," and the trials continued. The turning point, the night in the arena, was not like any night Daniel had ever known. The sky above glowed with shifting colors that bled into one another like liquid fire, and the air carried the low hum of strange machines hidden deep within the stone walls. The sand under his feet was stained dark from the battles he had fought, and his body bore the proof of each clash. His ribs ached with every breath, his arms trembled when he lifted them, and his skin was cut and bruised until he could hardly tell where the pain began and ended. Yet he stood still, refusing to let his legs fold beneath him. He knew the court above was watching, their eyes searching for the moment when the human would finally collapse, when the ground shifted again, and the heavy gates rumbled open. For the third time, Daniel braced himself. He expected more beasts, more claws, more teeth, but what came instead was different. The ground itself seemed to rise, stone pillars pushing upward, shaping the arena into a maze of narrow paths and cliffs. At the heart of it lay a great pit, glowing with light from deep below, a heat that carried the scent of burning metal. From another gate came a creature unlike the others he had faced. It stood on two legs, its body covered in thick hide that shimmered like iron, its head crowned with horns, and in its hands it carried a blade forged from black crystal. The crowd cheered in delight. This was no simple beast. This was a champion, bred and trained for killing. Daniel knew at once that this would not be a fight of quick tricks alone. This was a test of endurance, of spirit, and perhaps of fate. The champion roared, lifting its blade, and the sound rattled the very stones. Daniel's heart pounded, but he forced his breath steady. He could not match strength for strength, yet he could outthink. He darted back into the maze, letting the stone walls narrow the field, forcing the larger creature to follow. The champion swung its weapon, and the strike shattered stone where Daniel had stood a moment before. Shards rained down, cutting his skin, but he pressed onward. He climbed over rocks, slipping through gaps too narrow for the beast, always moving, always forcing it to chase. The court above jeered at his running, calling him coward again, but Daniel ignored them. He remembered the words of his commander. Back on Earth, that survival was not about pride, but about choosing the right moment to strike. At last he reached the edge of the glowing pit. Heat rose in waves, stinging his face, but he did not turn away. He stood there and waited. The champion lumbered forward, its heavy step shaking the ground, and raised its blade for the final blow. Daniel let it come close, closer than fear allowed. Then at the last heartbeat, he dropped low and rolled aside. The beast's momentum carried it forward, and its blade slammed into the ground with such force that the rock cracked. The creature staggered, off balance, and Daniel seized his chance. With a cry he leapt onto its back, gripping the ridges of its hide, and drove his bloodied shard of stone again and again into the soft places between its armor plates. The champion roared and spun, trying to shake him loose, but Daniel held on with desperate strength. Finally the beast stumbled too near the edge of the pit, its feet slipping on loose stone, and with one last push Daniel sent it tumbling forward. Its roar echoed as it plunged into the burning light below, and then it was gone. The arena fell into a silence so heavy it pressed against Daniel's ears. For a moment he swayed, his body screaming in exhaustion, his vision swimming, but he stayed standing. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his head toward the balconies above. The silence broke. Not with laughter this time, but with gasps and murmurs. The crowd had seen him defeat a beast of muscle and claw, and now they had watched him bring down a champion. Their jeers turned to uneasy whispers. Could it be possible that this fragile creature was more than they had believed? Princess Lyra leaned forward in her seat, her eyes fixed on the human below. At first she had mocked him only to amuse her court. Now as she watched him bloodied but unbowed, something strange stirred in her. She told herself it was only curiosity, yet her chest felt tight in a way she could not name. She remembered the way he had looked at her in the hall, unafraid, and now she saw that same fire burning in him still. Daniel lowered himself to one knee, not in surrender, but in sheer need of breath. He pressed his hand to his ribs, feeling the sticky warmth of blood, and for a moment he thought his strength would leave him. His thoughts blurred, but then images rose in his mind. He saw the blue sky of Earth, the faces of his comrades who had fallen in battle, the quiet smile of his sister waiting for him back home. He remembered why he could not fail. He was not here only for himself, but for every human who would be judged by his survival. He forced himself to stand again. The crowd above might never understand his thoughts, but they would see that a human refused to bow. He raised his head and whispered again the words that had carried him through every trial. "I will not fall." The princess rose slowly from her seat, her robes shimmering as she moved. She did not speak, but her eyes never left him. The court grew quiet, sensing her silence, and in that stillness Daniel felt something shift. It was not victory yet, but it was no longer mockery. He had turned their laughter into silence, their contempt into a question they did not yet dare to answer. The arena reset itself, the stone walls sinking back into the floor as though swallowed by the earth. The heat of the pit faded, leaving only the wide, empty ground once more. Daniel stood in the center, bloodied, weary, but alive. And in that moment, though he was only one man standing against an empire, he felt the balance begin to change. The death trials were not finished. But something inside him knew he had already passed the first true test. He had shown them that humans were not weak toys for their amusement. He had shown them what it meant to endure, and above, the princess who once mocked him now found herself unable to look away. The final trial, the arena had grown quiet after the fall of the champion into the pit, but the silence did not last. Soon the crowd began to murmur and call again, their voices mixing with both awe and disbelief. Daniel stood in the center, breathing heavy, his body bent with wounds but not yet broken. Sweat and blood ran down his arms, and his chest rose and fell with sharp breaths that burned his ribs. Yet his eyes still held that same steady fire that had carried him from the first beast to the last foe. Above, the nobles shifted in their seats, their laughter gone, their faces drawn with curiosity and unease. They had expected sport, yet what they were watching had turned into something else entirely. Princess Lyra did not sit as before. She remained standing, her hands resting against the railing of her high balcony, her gaze fixed on him without blinking. She had sworn that no human could survive, that he would be nothing more than dust in the sand of her arena. Now she watched him endure again and again, and for the first time in her life, she could not predict the outcome of what came next. A strange weight settled in her chest, a tightness that felt like both dread and fascination. The deep voice of the announcer rang across the chamber, echoing from the stone walls. He declared that the final trial would begin. The crowd roared with excitement, though it was tinged with the sharp edge of uncertainty. They wanted to see the end, whether in victory or in death, and they hungered for the answer. The floor of the arena shifted once more. This time it did not rise with jagged rocks or open to reveal pits. Instead, a single gate opened, and from it stepped a figure clad in gleaming armor. Unlike the beasts before, this was no creature born of tooth and claw. It was a warrior, tall and broad, his face hidden behind a black helm, his hands gripping a long spear tipped with shining steel. This was no random fighter but one of the Empire's elite, trained since birth to master every weapon, every tactic, and every strike. He moved with calm confidence, the kind that came only from countless battles fought and won. Daniel felt his stomach twist, for he knew at once this was the true test. Beasts could be tricked, traps could be laid, but a warrior with skill and reason was different. This was an enemy who could read his movements, who would not fall for the same tricks twice. His legs trembled, but he planted his feet firm on the sand. He had nothing in his hands but a shard of stone still slick with blood, yet he raised it as though it were a weapon worthy of the fight. The armored warrior strode forward, the spear glinting as he spun it once before striking. The first blow came fast, too fast for Daniel's tired body to fully avoid. The spear cut across his arm, leaving a deep line of blood. He staggered but stayed upright, forcing himself to circle, always keeping his eyes locked on the man behind the helm. He looked for weakness, for hesitation, but found none. Every step, every swing was measured, practiced. Deadly. The crowd shouted with wild joy, cheering their champion. Yet still they watched the human with eyes wide, wondering if he could somehow endure. Daniel knew he could not face the warrior head on. He needed to rely on what had carried him through before. He let the warrior press forward, striking again and again, and each time he dodged by inches, taking shallow cuts rather than deep ones. Pain lanced through his body, yet each wound taught him something. Each movement showed him more of the rhythm of the spear. He began to see the faint pattern, the way the warrior shifted his foot before thrusting. The fraction of a second when his stance opened. At last, Daniel found his moment. When the spear thrust forward, he twisted aside and let it scrape past his ribs, close enough to tear skin but not bone. In that instant he surged forward, seizing the shaft of the spear with both hands and pulling with all his strength. The warrior tried to wrench it free, but Daniel kicked against the sand, twisting his body, and the spear slipped from the warrior's grasp. The crowd gasped, for no one had ever seen an unarmed human wrest a weapon from one of their elite. Daniel staggered back, gripping the weapon. It was heavy, far heavier than any weapon from Earth, and his arms screamed in protest, yet he lifted it and pointed it forward. The warrior, unshaken, drew a blade from his side and came on again. The clash was brutal. Daniel fought with wild strikes, each one fueled not by training but by desperation. The warrior blocked, countered, and cut, driving Daniel back step by step. Blood dripped from his wounds, the sand beneath him dark with red, but he refused to yield. His spear cracked against armor, his body took blow after blow, yet his eyes never dimmed. Above, Princess Lyra gripped the railing, her knuckles white. She told herself it was madness, that he should already be lying dead in the sand, but her heart hammered in her chest with every strike he made. She whispered under her breath, though no one could hear, urging him to rise, to move, to fight on. She did not understand why she did it, only that she could not remain silent. At last the warrior struck hard, knocking Daniel to the ground. The spear clattered from his hands. The crowd roared, certain the end had come. The warrior raised his blade for the killing blow, but Daniel's hand found a shard of broken stone beneath him. With a shout he threw it, striking the gap between the warrior's helm and chest plate. The man faltered, staggering back. Daniel rolled to his knees, grabbed the fallen spear, and with the last of his strength drove it forward through the weak point in the armor. The warrior gave a single cry before collapsing, the sand shaking with his fall. The arena fell silent. Not a sound came from the balconies, not a whisper from the nobles. Even the princess could not breathe for a long moment as she stared at the human standing over the fallen body of her empire's champion. Daniel swayed, his body barely able to hold itself upright, blood dripping from every cut. but his hand still gripped the spear as though it were part of him, slowly, with effort. That tore through his chest. He lifted his head and faced the court above. His voice was rough, broken, yet it carried across the arena. "I still stand." The silence broke into chaos. Some shouted in outrage, others in disbelief, but none could deny what they had seen. A human, weak in body, had endured every trial and slain their warrior. Princess Lyra stood frozen, her mind racing. She remembered her own words, spoken in mockery before the court. If he survived, she had sworn, she would marry him. Now he had done the impossible. The weight of her oath pressed down on her shoulders, and yet she felt no shame. Instead, against all reason, her chest filled with a fierce and strange pride. And below, though his body threatened to collapse at any moment, Daniel whispered again to himself, "I will not fall." The promise fulfilled. The arena floor was painted red with dust and blood when the final clash ended. Daniel stood above the fallen warrior, his chest heaving, his arms trembling, his body cut and bruised beyond measure. Every muscle screamed for rest, every breath came sharp as fire, yet he remained standing. His legs shook as though they might give way, but he planted his feet in the sand and would not allow them to bend. He knew the eyes of the court were fixed upon him. He could feel their silence pressing down from every balcony, the weight of 1,000 stares, disbelief mixing with fear. The human had survived. Daniel lowered the heavy spear he had taken from the warrior and let it fall with a dull thud onto the sand. He did not need it anymore. His strength was nearly gone, yet his spirit remained unbroken. He raised his head, his face streaked with blood and dust, and looked directly toward the high balcony where Princess Lyra stood. Their eyes met across the vast chamber, and for a long breath, neither moved. The crowd shifted uneasily, waiting for the words that would follow, for the judgment of their princess. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She had spoken lightly before, her voice mocking when she made the promise, never believing it could be tested. Yet here stood the proof of her mistake, the human who had endured every beast and champion thrown against him, who had risen from wounds that should have ended him, who had looked death in the eye and refused to bow. She had promised before her court that she would marry him if he survived, and now the weight of her vow pressed heavily upon her. She could have turned away. She could have claimed her words were made in jest, that no promise bound her to a creature from a world so small and weak. The court would have accepted it, for she was princess and her word was law. Yet as she looked down at Daniel, she found she could not speak such lies. For the first time in her reign she felt something greater than pride and greater than fear. She felt respect, raw and undeniable, for the human who had shown her and her people what true strength meant. The announcer's voice rose, uncertain, trembling with the weight of history. He declared that the human had passed the trials, that no beast nor warrior had broken him, that by the law of oath, the princess's promise now stood. The crowd erupted, some in outrage, some in disbelief, and a few in awe. Warriors shouted that no alien could marry a human, nobles argued that the law must hold, and voices clashed in the chamber like a storm of thunder. Yet Daniel did not hear them. His ears rang with the sound of his heartbeat, and his eyes never left Lyra's. Slowly she raised her hand, and the court fell silent again. She stepped forward to the edge of the balcony, her silver robes flowing behind her, her crown glinting in the pale light. Her voice rang clear and strong, though her chest trembled with emotion she had never spoken before. This human has done what none believed possible. He has faced the trials of death and endured. He has fought with no armor, with no training in our ways, with no ally at his side. He has shown us that strength is not only in muscle or in blood, but in the will that refuses to break. I gave my word before all of you, and I will not turn from it. This man has earned what was promised. He will not be mocked any longer. The chamber shook with voices, some shouting in fury, others in astonishment. Yet the princess's words could not be undone. The law of their people held that a vow spoken before the court was binding, and her voice carried more power than all. Their cries combined. Daniel swayed on his feet, the world blurring around him. He could hardly believe what he had heard, yet the sound of her voice, no longer filled with scorn but with honor, filled him with a strength deeper than his wounds. He fell to one knee, not from surrender, but because his body finally demanded rest. Guards rushed into the arena, not to strike him down, but to lift him gently, carrying him toward the gates. The crowd parted as he was taken from the floor, still alive, still defiant. That night the Empire spoke of nothing else. The story of the human who survived spread through the halls, through the streets, through the ships that orbited the skies. Some cursed his name, saying it was shame to their people. Others whispered that perhaps humanity was not as weak as they had thought. For every alien who mocked, another spoke of his courage. The balance of belief had begun to shift. In her private chambers, Princess Lyra sat in silence. She looked at her reflection in a polished mirror of crystal, her mind restless. She remembered the first time she had seen him, standing in chains, his body fragile, his eyes steady. She had laughed then, certain he would break. Yet now she saw the same eyes again in her memory, burning with a fire that even her strongest warriors had never shown. She realized with a strange shiver that she no longer saw him as prey or as plaything. She saw him as equal. When Daniel awoke, he found himself in a room unlike the arena, its walls smooth and pale, its air clean. His wounds had been bound with alien medicine that cooled his burns and closed his cuts. He tried to rise, though pain still gripped him, and he saw her standing by the door. Lyra entered quietly, her crown set aside, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "You were not meant to survive," she said, "and yet you did." Daniel's throat was dry, but he forced the words out. "I told you, I will not fall." For a moment, she was silent, then she smiled faintly, though her eyes shone with something deeper than mockery. "No, you did not fall. And now, by my word, you stand not as prisoner, but as promised. My people may not understand. Perhaps I do not fully understand, but I will honor what I spoke. You have my respect, Daniel of Earth, and you have my hand." He looked at her, still weary, still in disbelief, but he saw no jest in her face. For the first time since his capture, he felt the heavy chains around his spirit loosen. He had come as a captive mocked for weakness, and now he stood as the man who had turned their laughter into silence. Outside, the Empire stirred with the tale of the human who endured. Inside, in the quiet of that chamber, two figures stood facing one another, the human and the princess, no longer bound by mockery, but by something far stronger. And though the trials were ended, Daniel knew in his heart that his words would carry him still through whatever came next. "I will not fall." The end.